Frank, Julie, I tell you what, it is a very interesting situation. Now, officers and members of the community reached out to KTVU and asked for me specifically to moderate this conversation. Now, this is a subject near and dear to me. As reporters, we both see both sides, the community and law enforcement. And being an African-American man, I've personally experienced some of the issues facing African-American and Latinos. And I also know in order to make things better, it has to have a discussion and see what common ground we can find.
But as a law enforcement officer,
More than 30 men and women from all walks of life.
Benjamin Cover here at Master Barbershop.
Officer Ken Shedd, San Leandro Police Department.
Yeah, I'm Jerry Oster. I'm formerly incarcerated, first of all. I did 27 years on a gang-related homicide.
Sekou Millington. I'm a lieutenant with the Oakland Police Department.
My name is Reverend Harry Williams.
Came together at Master's Barbershop in San Leandro. The purpose? To have a town hall discussion about what's facing the African-American and Latino community when it comes to their dealings with law enforcement.
There exists this gap between the community and police officers and just the criminal justice system.
Those here agree that gap didn't just start. It's something that's been around for generations.
During slavery, it was the brother that wanted to read and wanted to run away and be free. You know, he was the black criminal.
I've been in situations where I did not like the police. I grew up right here in Oakland.
Nearly everyone in the shop said they've had negative dealings with law enforcement or felt discriminated against at different times in their lives. A commonality for both sides. But the separation began to grow when the discussion dealt with difficult topics, like fatal officer-involved shootings. In 2009, Oscar Grant, an unarmed black man, was shot and killed by a BART police officer.
Johannes Measurely spent less time in jail than Michael Vick, right? That's a very difficult thing for a community to accept.
In 2010, Derek Jones, an Oakland barber who was unarmed, shot and killed because police mistook a scale for a gun. And last year, Mario Woods, who was armed with a knife, was shot and killed by San Francisco police.
It's a situation to me where officers either appear to be overly aggressive and or afraid of a situation and therefore respond in a way that to me is inappropriate in those cases.
This topic led some to question, why must officers use lethal force when killing a suspect?
We don't train officers to kill, right? That's not what they're trained to do. They're trained to stop the threat.
Others ask, could an officer just wound the person by shooting them in a body part?
I know my capabilities and I know how I shoot. I would probably miss an arm or a leg. And so just so happened that round would travel down the field and hit someone else.
Deadly force is called deadly force because it's meant to stop the threat, not partially injured the threat or wound the threat.
I understand using force when needed, but we see a lot of force being used when it's not really necessary.
She's referring to some cases we've seen nationally captured on video. In 2014, Eric Gardner was standing outside a New York store when police say he was illegally selling cigarettes. Gardner died when officers put him in a chokehold. Garner was unarmed. In July of this year, Philando Castile shot 4 times in his car in Minnesota after being pulled over for a broken taillight. Castile was armed but licensed to carry. According to his fiancée, he was shot while reaching for his proper papers for his weapon. September of this year, Terrence Crutcher, a 40-year-old father of 4, was on the side of the road with his vehicle awaiting assistance when officers responded to the stalled vehicle. After officers arrived, Crutcher is seen walking away with his hands up. Moments later, he was shot and killed by a Tulsa police officer. The officer claimed she thought Crutcher was reaching for a weapon. Turns out, Crutcher was unarmed.
There has been a lack of outcry from officers of color nationwide about the things that we see. And it's very difficult for the community to accept that.
When something happens in the community, since we can't stand up, we need y'all to stand up. Because stuff is happening to us, to black folks getting killed and getting murdered every day.
There have been some instances that you know, the officer made a mistake or they went a little bit too far.
Just that little bit of accountability, some say, will go a long way when officers aren't afraid to say their colleagues are wrong. That's just one of several ways that this group say leads to solutions, which can bring about change that can heal the community. The first step they recommend is looking in the mirror and starting a conversation at home.
We all have biases, and whether we know it or not, we do have them, And in recognizing them, we take the first step in making a change.
We have to educate not only the public, but officers in general. We just need to respect each other, right? It starts with respect.
You're talking about economics, you're talking about politics, you're talking about education, you're talking about a whole lot of different things that need fixing. So we got to educate everybody, you know, across the board. And this can't just be a conversation about law enforcement and they need to do better. Everybody has to do better.
Now, the officers and community members agreed that one way of bridging the divide is to have more people of color occupying jobs in law enforcement. Now, this was just a glimpse into that conversation that lasted more than 2 hours. The group also talked about Black Lives Matters, taking accountability, and racial profiling. Now, we're working on a 30-minute special that will air at a later date, and they also plan to meet once again.
That conversation was absolutely fascinating, and I think those kinds of conversations are so important right now. However, I couldn't help but notice that there were no white police officers there. Is there a reason for that? Yes, the reason is that they want to have the conversation at home with the family. It was an African-American barbershop, so that's what's going to happen. But the next conversation, they want to invite Caucasian officers out there because they want to make sure it was safe. You know, the officers don't know how that conversation was going to happen. They don't want to bring their counterparts in and feel like they're being attacked. So they wanted to understand how it was going to go before we go forward.
Such an important first step.
Can I just ask you real quickly, we only have a second here, but what did you get out of it?
Oh my gosh, so much. It was very interesting because, you know, like we said, we see it on both sides. We see it as reporters, we see the community, we see police officers. I found that conversation needs to be happening. It needs to happen. Because without that conversation, we can't heal.